In February 2022, Vladimir Putin sent 190,000 soldiers into Ukraine. He told them it would take 3 days. 3 days. It is now 2026. The war is in its 5th year. More than 1 million people are dead. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Ukraine still exists. Russia still occupies large portions of it. And the peace talks that were supposed to end everything have produced nothing except confusion. In January 2026, Donald Trump told a cabinet meeting that he had personally called Vladimir Putin and asked him to stop bombing Ukrainian cities for 1 week because of the extreme cold, and that Putin had agreed. Ukraine said there was no official agreement. Russia's own state media could not agree on what had been decided. Trump said the call was excellent. That is where the most consequential war in Europe since World War II currently stands. 3 men, Trump, Putin, Zelensky, none of them agreeing on what was said, none of them agreeing on what peace even means. And a continent holding its breath waiting to find out if NATO, the alliance that kept Europe safe for 70 years, is still the force it used to be. To understand how we got here, you need to go back, not to 2022, not even to 2022, not even to 2014. You need to go back to 1994. And a promise that was made and broken and is still being paid for today. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became an independent nation. It also became, overnight, the 3rd largest nuclear power on Earth. On its territory sat approximately 900 nuclear warheads left over from the Soviet arsenal. More nuclear weapons than Britain, France, and China combined. Ukraine did not ask for them. It had not built them. It had not built them. But there they were. The United States and Russia desperately wanted those weapons removed. A nuclear-armed Ukraine, newly independent, potentially unstable, was a nightmare scenario for everyone. So a deal was made. In December 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum. It agreed to give up every single one of its nuclear weapons. In exchange, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed a document providing Ukraine with security assurances. They pledged to respect Ukraine's borders and sovereignty. They pledged to refrain from the threat or use of force against Ukraine. They pledged to bring the matter to the United Nations Security Council if Ukraine was ever threatened. Ukraine gave up the weapons. Russia invaded in 2014, then again in 2022. The United States and United Kingdom did not intervene militarily. The UN Security Council, where Russia has a veto, could not act. The Budapest Memorandum was not a treaty. It had no enforcement mechanism. It was a political commitment, worth exactly as much as the political will of the countries that signed it, which, as it turned out, was not very much. To understand why Putin invaded, you need to understand how he sees the world. Vladimir Putin has never accepted the legitimacy of Ukrainian nationhood. In a 5,000-word essay published in July 2021, 8 months before the invasion, he argued that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that Ukraine as a separate nation is an artificial creation, and that the modern Ukrainian state was essentially a historical accident. In June 2025, he went further. He told an audience that all of Ukraine is ours. That is not a negotiating position. That is an annexation plan dressed in historical language. But the stated trigger for the 2022 invasion was not history. It was NATO. Putin had made clear for years, in speeches, in diplomatic documents, in direct warnings to Western leaders, that he considered NATO expansion eastward to be an existential threat to Russia. In December 2021, just weeks before the invasion, Russia sent formal written demands to NATO requiring a legally binding guarantee that Ukraine would never be admitted to the alliance. NATO refused. What followed was the largest land war in Europe since 1945. Now here is the part that makes this story genuinely complicated. Putin's fear of NATO expansion is not entirely invented. After the Cold War ended, Western leaders did make informal assurances to Soviet and Russian officials that NATO would not expand eastward. Those assurances were never put in writing. They were never legally binding. And NATO expanded anyway, taking in Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria. Country after country that had once been behind the Iron Curtain joined the Western Alliance. From Moscow's perspective, a military alliance that had been pointed at Russia for 40 years was now sitting on Russia's doorstep. From Washington's perspective, every country has the right to choose its own alliances. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, and the gap between them is where the war lives. Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion shocked the world. Everyone, including most Western intelligence agencies, expected Kyiv to fall within days. Russia's military was considered one of the most powerful in the world. Ukraine's was considered an afterthought. Within the first 72 hours, Ukrainian forces had stopped the Russian advance on Kyiv. Within weeks, they had pushed Russian troops back from the capital entirely. Within months, they had retaken significant territory in the northeast and the south. The war that was supposed to last 3 days settled into something that looked much more like the grinding attrition of the First World War. Trenches, artillery duels across fixed lines, thousands of casualties for gains measured in hundreds of meters. Western nations poured support into Ukraine, weapons, ammunition, training, intelligence, billions of dollars. But the support came with conditions and hesitations that frustrated Ukrainian commanders constantly. Certain weapons were provided too slowly. Certain capabilities, long-range missiles that could strike Russian territory, were withheld or delayed. Every escalatory step was preceded by weeks of Western debate about how far was too far. Russia, meanwhile, adapted. It absorbed early losses. It reorganized its military. It sourced ammunition from North Korea. It deployed Iranian drones. It put its economy on a war footing. By 2025, the front lines had largely stabilized. Ukraine held roughly 80% of its pre-2022 territory. Russia held the rest. Neither side had the strength to achieve a decisive breakthrough, and the war ground on. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he had promised to end the war in 24 hours. He had been saying this for months on the campaign trail. 24 hours. It had been saying this for months on the campaign trail. 24 hours. It has now been over a year. Trump's approach to the conflict was fundamentally different from his predecessors. Where Biden had committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, Trump was openly skeptical of the cost and openly warm toward Putin. His peace proposals, formulated by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were described by analysts as broadly favorable to Russia. The core framework was simple. Ukraine would freeze the front lines where they stood. Russia would keep the territory it currently occupies. Ukraine would receive security guarantees from European nations, and Ukraine would formally abandon its NATO membership ambitions. Ukraine rejected this. Giving up NATO membership and accepting Russian territorial gains permanently was, from Kyiv's perspective, a reward for aggression, a signal to every nuclear power on Earth that invasion works. Russia also rejected this, because Putin's stated war aims go far beyond the territory currently occupied. He wants all 4 regions Russia has annexed. He wants a Ukraine that is neutral, demilitarized, and poses no future threat. Trump, growing frustrated with both sides, said he was more than open to walking away from the negotiations entirely. Europe watched all of this with growing alarm. The most significant geopolitical shift produced by the Ukraine war is not happening on the battlefield. It is happening inside NATO. For the first time since the alliance was founded in 1949, serious questions are being asked publicly by senior officials about whether the United States can be relied upon as a NATO partner. Trump's skepticism of NATO, his praise for Putin, his suggestion that he might not defend NATO members who do not meet defense spending targets, his withdrawal of intelligence sharing with European allies at key moments, all of it has forced Europe into a conversation it never expected to have. What if America is no longer the backstop? France and the United Kingdom, Europe's only nuclear powers, began organizing what they called a coalition of the willing, a group of European nations prepared to deploy forces inside Ukraine as part of a future ceasefire monitoring arrangement without waiting for American approval. British and French officials announced plans to establish military hubs across Ukraine. Putin immediately said he would not accept NATO troops on Ukrainian soil under any description. Meanwhile, Germany, which had spent the post-World War II era deliberately limiting its military role, announced a historic rearmament program. Poland began building the largest land army in Europe. The Baltic states, Finland, and Sweden accelerated their own defense spending to levels not seen since the Cold War. Europe is rearming, quietly, quickly, with an urgency that tells you everything about how seriously European governments now take the Russian threat and how little they trust Washington to be there if it materializes. What does history tell us about wars like this one? About conflicts that grind into frozen lines where neither side can win outright and neither side is willing to accept the terms the other offers? The honest answer is, they rarely end cleanly. The Korean War ended in an armistice in 1953. The line it froze is still there today. 70 years later, North and South Korea are technically still at war. The conflict in Cyprus has been frozen since 1974. The line dividing the island has barely moved. Frozen conflicts do not resolve themselves. They wait, they simmer, they occasionally reignite when the conditions change. The most likely outcome in Ukraine, based on where the negotiations stand today, is some form of frozen conflict, a ceasefire along current lines, no formal peace treaty, no recognition of Russian annexations by Ukraine or the West, no NATO membership for Ukraine in the near term. Russian forces dug in, Ukrainian forces rebuilding, both sides waiting for the next round. That outcome would mean Russia keeps territory it seized by force. It would mean Ukraine survives as an independent state but diminished. It would mean NATO's credibility in Eastern Europe depends on whether the alliance can rebuild trust after the fractures of the Trump years. And it would mean Vladimir Putin, who was supposed to be isolated, economically destroyed, and militarily humiliated by Western sanctions and support for Ukraine, is still in power. Still in control of Russian territory larger than any European nation, and still waiting. Shh. The thing about Putin is, he has never been in a hurry. And that patience is the most dangerous thing about him. This is The Fallen Empires. Subscribe for weekly history, war, and geopolitics. We will see you next week.